Hello and welcome. This is the next of a series of videos that I'm making on the new Three Kingdoms DLC. This video specifically focuses on the new things that you can do with random map scripting. If you want a more general overview of the objects, I have a different video for that, which is probably linked somewhere. And I also made a video going over the new maps and the changes to the maps from a more casual standpoint. For the map scripting changes themselves, we have, I need to pull up a notepad, you guys can see it, should be available, yeah. So we have a bunch of new things that are in the random map def file that come predefined. So we have the limestone cliffs, we have these different season times, these are essentially new color corrections. I've listed them now in numerical order. Actually default, why do I have default listed here? Default shouldn't be new. Default shouldn't be new. Let's take that one out. There we go. But yeah, evening, spring, savanna, arctic, rainforest, swamp, steppes, misty, summer, murky. Of course, these are all only visible to players who have the necessary color correction setting enabled in their options menu. You can also test what they look like on a map in the scenario editor by clicking here. Jungle, misty, murky, night. So I'll definitely be adding these to my maps. I don't know about the night ones, those weren't so well received when I put them on hyper-random, but most of the other ones are surely fine. Next up, if we keep scrolling, we have some new objects that are defined. Namely, we have the Fire Tower, Crusader Knight. We have this is a new type of deer. We have the Lush Bamboo Tree, Asian Pine Tree, Peach Blossom Tree, the Willow Tree, the Maple Trees in the Autumn and Green variation. We have the chicken and the wild chicken in each of their variations. And note here the chicken object is basically a sheep with 65 food, and the wild chicken is a deer with 65 food, and it can't be pushed very far from its starting location, so it can't be pushed to the town center. The wild chicken features on some of the updated maps, all of the most commonly played ones. Arabia, Arena, Black Forest, Nomad have all been updated to include chickens some or all of the time. If you want to see what all these objects look like, check out my other video where I have those in detail. This is more just about on a technical level what's available. We have the Arabian wolf and the black bear and polar bear. These are just reskins of the bear and wolf to fit other climates. We have the wild horse B, C, D, and E, which is the equivalent to wild horse A. It's basically a non-player controlled Gaia animal. It doesn't have any food. With RMS trickery, you can surely give it food. But these horses previously only existed as player-controlled objects. Now there's a specific wild version. Same for the monkey and the penguin, which is nice, so we no longer have to use the Furious the Monkey Boy and the Cheat Penguin unit, and we no longer need to call our monkeys smoke monkeys anymore. We can actually call them a monkey. Then we have these stump objects, and those look like, bamboo, baobab, normal tree. Those are just the new stumps. I think these are temporary or permanent. I'd have to double check that. I will update the spreadsheet. I've already updated it with everything that was publicly available prior to today, and now that everything is available, I can fully update the spreadsheet. That'll take a couple days, probably this weekend. This all came at very short notice. We have these fell trees. These look like a stump, however, they have 100 food, or in the case of baobab, 200 food on them. So it's basically a pre-cut tree. That could be useful for your maps if you want to sort of put some just thematically next to lumber camps, or to suggest where players should cut trees. We have some new terrains. We have the palm grass forest. We have the palm grass forest. That's not new. Maybe the fact that it's defined is new. Yeah, probably this default, like the constant for it is new. The constant for this is new, however, the actual object isn't new. Same with the Fire Tower and the Crusader Knight, of course. These are existing objects, but the fact that the constant exists for it is new. Right. The lush bamboo forest is new, and then we have this yellow water that exists in a shallows version and in a shallow and deep water version. Once again, to see what they look like, check out my other video. This is just the fact that we have these new constants. Then we have some new attributes, which are here. There's some documentation in the preview patch notes, and perhaps some additional patch notes will be coming out in the future that will have more information about them. I'm not going to say anything further, but these constants now exist. There are also additional resources and attributes that are moddable that don't have constants, but that were mentioned in the preview patch notes. So there's definitely more that we can modify from our map script. We also got new placeholders for on and off grid objects, specific dedicated placeholder objects, so we don't need to use a dead fish trap or, dead constable Richmond or something like that. We have generic ones that can be placed anywhere. We have ones that can be placed only on land. We have ones that can be placed amphibiously. So that includes land, but also shallows and beaches. We have naval. That basically includes water, but also shallows and beaches. And we have water, which is only full water terrains. And then we have off-grid versions as well of all of those. So you can use these specific placeholder objects instead of having to find suitable or modify other objects in the data. Next up, we have math operations. And that's where it gets interesting. I've done a rudimentary amount of experimentation. TOS was also doing some. He did some fun stuff as well. You can do addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. And the format for doing this is that you have to have parentheses around your math operation. The parentheses need to be touching the first and last term. The actual operators need to have spaces between everything else. Right. Operators require spaces. Numbers and constants must not have spaces to the bounding parentheses. As with const, the first time you set something is final. So the ways it works here is like we can set, basically these operations work over const. So you can assign a numeric value to a constant label and then do math with that. Essentially, they can function as variables, but you can't update this later. You can't later say, B should be 7 or B should be, B plus 1. That doesn't work. It's relatively simple what we can do here. Operations are processed left to right. There's no specific regard for order of operations. 0.5 rounds up, and rounding occurs whenever a const is saved, and also in between when division is occurring at certain points. The exact details of that, TOS is more versed in. He was doing a lot of experimenting with that. Right, you can use existing constants inside parentheses, and they will work as if they were the number that they represent. So you can do silly things like this, or like this. Where was I? All right, R&D, this also has brackets. This construct cannot be used inside of a bracketed construct like that. However, it can be used in combination with const. Like here, we say, with this rand, we want it to be some number in between 1 and 6. And then whatever it is, that's what rand will then have as a value. So in this specific generation, rand had 2, so we have 2 houses for each player. What else have I said here? Yeah, nesting doesn't work. Like here, I did some nesting. The 5 is ignored. It just does gold count plus 2. Map path options can only be used where numeric input is accepted. You can't you can't use these. You can't use a number in place. Like if create terrain or terrain type can't take a number as an input. It takes the terrain that's represented by that number. That makes sense. So essentially, here we've defined that terrain as like if we put some math into here, like terrain type equals brackets 2 plus 1 or just brackets around 2, that wouldn't work. We need to have a constant already. And then just some additional information. Certain commands can apparently accept floating point values directly now, namely terrain cost, guard state, effect amount, and effect percent, which renders effect percent obsolete, supposedly. Perhaps not, because there's surely some amount of decimal places that this is limited to and might still be more precise. Maybe, I don't know. And terrain cost is, of course, for connections, and all of these are used in player setup. So I just did a few some math examples here, right? You can do some simple, addition. You can do multiplication. You can do more complicated expressions, which then, this will round up to 4. You can then basically take a constant that you've defined previously and use that as a number of objects or as anything that needs a numeric input. You can use it for actor area coordinates. You can use it probably for numeric IDs as well. I did only limited testing with it. You can also, instead of putting a constant there, you can put a math expression in this location, and you can also can put brackets around the constant. You don't need to, but you can. So yeah, I just did a bit of testing with the math. There's surely more that can be figured out there, but this already lets us do quite a bit with computing player positions or not having to manually scale everything. You can essentially multiply, say, the number of cliffs by a scaling factor, and you've defined a scaling factor that takes a certain value based on the map size or the map area. Or you could calculate the map area based on the map size and then pass that on as the scaling factor. There's a bunch of new included files that are used for the new Crazini maps in the game directory. And many of them use these new expressions, so it's worth checking those out. Yeah, right. That's the first step of things I wanted to go to. I wanted to look at 2 other things. First one is require path. This stuff, now I need to double check. You guys can see it. Yep. So we're going to switch to my second example here. So what you're seeing here is as follows. First of all, I just used this to also note that on Mishi, the markets are now visible when you play Explored, and the way to do that is by setting the attribute fog flag. So that doesn't specifically have anything to do with the example I'm showing here, but just another thing that's updated. I want to note that. What I've created here is a bamboo forest for each player, and then I've created a connection going out of it. The center of the land is right there. The 2 players are connected by this connection, right? And then I've used the new require path attribute. And this attribute can take a numeric integer flag. If you don't give it 1 or if you give it 0, then that just means that the object must have a path to the land origin. So if I didn't have this connection, opening up the bamboo forest, then there would be no path from the center of the land to the outside, and the scouts would not be able to spawn. However, since I do have this path, they are able to spawn. So if you use flag 0, that's just for preventing resources being completely trapped. You basically want to use this all the time unless you specifically want to have player resources be trapped. Unless that's your goal, you should always have a require path. Now these other flags, essentially, if you add a 1 or if you add anything larger than 1, then the object must have a direct path, let's say a line of sight to the player origin. However, it's a bit more complicated than that in that the value of this number determines how direct the path needs to be. In our example here, my required path is currently set to 10. If I change this to 1, and we keep the same seed, you'll see that the angular deflection, say, of these scouts has gotten narrower. And you'll also notice that the blue ones have a lot more freedom in where they spawn. I'd say that's probably because this is a longer, narrow, constricted path, and it's less constricted. If we generate different ones, it'll look different each time, right? Depending on how constricted it is. And if you make this a lot bigger, then the scouts can spawn further away. Like basically, not everywhere, but more than half of the full circle of possible paths here. So presumably you'll want to use this with fairly low numbers. The idea is to prevent resources from being trapped behind a wood line, like having your gold, over there with a fat wood line in the way. You have to be a bit careful with this because, of course, it restricts where you can place resources. This is a contrived example just to illustrate how it works. Then the third thing I want to look at, next script, is tile shuffling. So this is fairly simple. And also you can now use create elevation, can now accept values up to 16. Base elevation can still accept values up to infinity, but you probably don't want to go that high, but you can now create elevation up to 16, both in the scenario editor, actually, if you go to elevation here, and also in your create elevation section statements. And then the find path stuff. So essentially, enable tile shuffling never really did anything. It didn't really change anything in a useful way in the past, and now it does. In that, we have basically, I'm generating a relic here and I'm generating a gold here. These commands are exactly the same except that I added tile shuffling, and the notable things, and that the radius is slightly different so that they're not overlapping. So the notable thing here is that I have a minimum distance to players. I'm saying it should be in a circle, and I'm telling the resources to find the closest tiles. Now, if you don't shuffle the tiles, as with the relics, then they all end up on one side, right? But if you do the tile shuffling, then it's more spread out. Not perfectly spread out, but it's a much better spread. So essentially, if you're using find closest, and you don't want your resources to be in places that are too predictable, then you should enable tile shuffling. That's also going to be a command that you basically want to add to most of your player objects, unless you're trying to specifically manipulate find closest to place resources in specific places. But otherwise, you'll generally want to be adding enable tile shuffling now. And finally, neutral lands are no longer avoided by min distance to players. In the past, these deer would have avoided this central land as well. Now they do not. This is not a change that's been versioned. It's a change that just takes effect. So you'll want to check your maps. If any of your maps were relying on resources avoiding neutral lands, then you might have to do things differently there now. Overall, though, this is perhaps it should have been versioned, but I would say it's still a positive change. And it means that you can now use min distance to players on direct placement maps. Or not specifically on that, on maps that consist where the entire map is made of like 100 grid of lands, right? Or just a lot of lands. you don't have to rely on actor areas for everything anymore. You can actually just use min distance to players now. This will only apply to the players themselves. So that's what I want to show you for now. There is of course all the new content from the DLC, but I have a separate video for that. This is basically just focused on the map scripting changes. We might find out more about how the math works or that there were more other changes, but I hope this was an informative overview to start things out for you. Thanks for watching.